and welcome to the next video. Or, I should probably say for the topic of this video, bonjour, because today we are exploring the French and their history of this area. So the Miami and Potawatomi were living here for a number of years, and it wasn't until the late 1600s that the French first arrived exploring the region. We're going to talk about some of the early explorers here, how the Miami and Potawatomi encountered them, and some of the reasons why the French were here, which include spreading religion and also fur trading, and the influences and impact that those two groups had on the native groups that lived here, and how even today the French have an impact and an influence through whether it was naming places, naming rivers, naming cities, and how they still have an impact even today in our community. So let's explore the French. The French were introduced to this area through simple exploration. And the first French to explore this region were a crew of men led by René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle. La Salle and his men were traversing the Great Lakes in 1679. Aboard their ship, the Griffin, they worked their way through Lake Erie and Lake Huron and arrived at Mackinac Island. Here, native groups in the region encountered the French for the first time, and they traded goods together. La Salle and his crew continued west across Lake Michigan and landed where Green Bay, Wisconsin is today. They would work their way south on Lake Michigan and would finally explore inland by traveling down the river, the Miami, which we know today as the St. Joseph River. Making their way through the river, they followed the twists and turns and would stop and carry their supplies overland and move to the Kankakee River. This area, where La Salle and his crew portaged from one river to the other, is where South Bend, Indiana is today. La Salle and his men would continue traveling south, eventually reaching the Mississippi River, making their way south to present-day New Orleans. From these explorations, and the explorations of other French, the French government claimed a territory occupied by a number of native groups as their own. This area, named New France, extended from the Gulf of Mexico all the way through Canada to the Hudson Bay. Here we have an image known as Father Marquette and the Indians, which was painted in 1869. And the story behind this painting, or the topic that we want to talk about, is the work that French missionaries had in this area. So one of the main goals of the French as they came here was to convert the native populations to the Catholic faith and Christianity. So as New France was established, missionary groups were sent here to go from village to village to preach the word of God and hopefully convert the native populations to this new faith. Now, the reaction of the native people in the Miami and Potawatomi living here was mixed. Some groups converted, maybe due to the fact that they were open to this new faith, but also with trading, they thought it was a better economic opportunity to convert. They would get a better deal through trading. Some groups did not convert at all. Other groups thought that this was an opportunity to discuss their faith with another outsider group. So the missionaries continued to push and push and push and convert the populations. Now locally, wanting to establish a center or hub for this activity, Jesuit priest Claude Jean Alloway established a mission known as the St. Joseph Mission. Later, the French military built a fort around this mission known as Fort St. Joseph, and that is located where Niles, Michigan is today. Now, as these missionaries were going from village to village and visiting the native populations in this area, the Miami and the Potawatomi, the missionaries took kind of an interesting role in the entire relationship with the French and the native population. The missionaries saw themselves as protectors of the native population. One way they did that to protect the native people is they served as translators, because to convert the native populations, one of the things that the missionaries did was learn the language of these native groups, whether it was the Miami language or the Potawatomi language. Missionaries did that so they were able to communicate more effectively. So they served as translators. So if a missionary was in a village and a fur trader came wanting to trade with the native population, the missionary could translate because he knew both languages. And the missionaries looking to protect the native populations would also speak up when they thought that the fur traders were exploiting native populations? And that's an interesting question to think about. And when we think about this role of protector, did the missionaries really have to protect the native populations? The Miami and the Potawatomi living here, we know, were advanced, experienced in the trade. They were a very strong and intelligent society. Did they really need someone to look after them and protect them? Or was it something that the missionaries, their values, decided to dictate and impress upon native populations? Now, with this idea of protecting, especially when it came to the fur trade, the missionaries would speak out against the fur traders. So much so that it really began to hurt and affect the economic relationship that the French had in this area when it came to fur trading. It became such an issue that the French government and the French king actually recalled all the missionaries from North America in 1754. That way the missionaries came back to France, and that allowed the French fur traders to continue on and be able to get the most successful deals that they could with the native population. Now, even though the French missionaries left in 1754, if we look back today, they had a very important impact on our understanding of what this area looked like, what the native people, how the native people operated, and how the French worked into this new society here. Because the missionaries served as historians. Through their travels, they would write down a number of different things in books and record their interactions with native populations. And we use that today to understand what this area was like way back then. So much so that even native populations trace some of their own history from French missionary recordings and histories. So they are really important for us to understand what life was like back then. Other than converting the native populations to Christianity, the other main goal of the French here in what was they considered to be New France was economic. They were fueled by making money, by doing business, and that was done through the fur trade. There are a number of different fur traders that traveled all throughout North America. Now, if you wanted to be a fur trader, you could do it in two different ways. You first could be a voyageur. You could be hired by one of these larger fur trading companies that would employ a number of different people who travel from village to village within a territory. Or if you wanted to strike out on your own, you would be known as a coureur de bois, who would negotiate and trade specifically with native populations to try to earn a living and also become profitable. So with coureur de bois and voyageurs traveling this area, going from village to village, the trading started between the French and the native populations. So the native population has been trading for hundreds of years before that, and when the French came here, they were putting in new items, and you can see we have some here. Whether it was metal pots that the native populations could use for cooking, whether it was tools, like you can see here this axe that they would use to chop down trees and make a number of different things with, or even it was something simple like a blanket. Now, this blanket was made out of wool, so native populations had never had a blanket made out of this. These were some of the items that they would trade for. Now, all of these things might have a specific need, and the voyageurs and coureur de bois were trading with native populations for these things. They would also be bringing things that might not necessarily have a need, but you might like them. For example, trade silver and trade gold, things like that you would put pendants that you put on necklaces. They were things you might not necessarily need, but were in high demand because they were used for decoration and ornamentation. The native populations wanted them. Now, one of the interesting things were for these fur traders to gain the trust of the native populations, they integrated themselves into the culture. So fur traders would come to a village and to build trust would learn the traditions and ways that the native populations were living. Now, not only was that used to gain trust, but it was also a simple way of survival. Imagine if you're from France, you travel over the Atlantic Ocean, you're in a new environment, you don't know what's safe to eat, you don't know where animals are to hunt, to feed yourself. So by gaining the trust of the native populations, these traders were shown by the native populations what was safe, where to find food, basically how to survive. So, and in some instances, fur traders would be living in these villages as well. And it was a way for them to survive, but also gain the trust, so when trading did occur, they could make themselves a better deal. So what would happen is when the French would trade for these items, they get furs in return, and those furs that they would take to major hubs like military forts, for example in this area, Fort St. Joseph, or Fort Miami at the mouth of the St. Joseph River on Lake Michigan. They would sell these furs to bigger companies, which would put them on large ships and send them back across the ocean to France. So outside of missionary work, fur trading was another vital part of the French experience here in North America when they first arrived here in the 16 and 1700s. So the French traded and did missionary work in New France for a number of decades. And it wasn't until the end of the French and Indian War in the 1750s where the French lost So the French arrived here in the 1670s, and it wouldn't be until the 1750s where they start to lose influence. Mostly because in the 1750s, the British and the French fought against each other in the French and Indian War, and native groups sided with the French here. So at the end of the war, the British were victorious, and the French gave up most of their territorial claim and lost New France. The native populations would now encounter the British, and a whole new relationship had to be formed for trading, for religious work, for a number of other different things. But the French had a very important influence. They were the first European groups that the native people like the Miami and Potawatomi living in this area encountered. They established the trading network with the native groups, which introduced a number of different things. And they spread religion across this area where some native groups decided to convert to Christianity. So that influence is still left today on many of the native populations that live here. And a number of places are named due to French places in this area. If you look at a map in our area, it's pretty easy to see the French that still have their influence here. So hopefully you've learned a little bit about the French history in this area, and we'll see you in the next video. Au revoir.